Welcome to the One Question Leadership Podcast. This is Chrissy Raywalk, Director of Intercollegiate Athletics at the University of Delaware. One of the things that I appreciate and enjoy most about leadership is that it's a journey, not a destination. It involves lots of different twists and turns, and you need many different types of people to go along with you on your journey in order for it to be successful. So today, I invite you to start your leadership journey with this podcast. Enjoy.
Greetings, this is Ty Brown, and welcome to the One Question Leadership Podcast, where we highlight executive and organizational leadership. Be sure to follow us on Twitter and Instagram at 1Q Leadership. Our guest today is Dr. LaKeitha Poole. LaKeitha is Director of Student Athlete Mental Health and currently Interim Senior Advisor to the Athletics Director for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion at LSU. Greetings, LaKeitha. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, Ty. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
I'm glad to have you on. Now, you're also an adjunct instructor in the College of Human Sciences and Education's department. And this is your fifth year in college athletics, but you have, for the lack of a better term, gathered a wealth of influence in athletics. And you also spent time at LSU's Office of Multicultural Affairs. So I think there's a few things we can talk about here. First, the role of senior or interim senior advisor to the AD for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion is new since the last we talked on the video for Athletic Director U. So I wonder if you can tell me what that role entails.
Yeah, sure. That is a change since the last time you and I chatted. So that role in particular came out of developing a series of initiatives that a lot of universities actually were doing at the time post the George Floyd murder in particular, but obviously knowing that there was a need well before that for athletics departments in particular to consider what does it look like to also have diversity and inclusion as a part of their values and the culture. And so LSU, like many other schools, tried to take a lead on developing what that could look like permanently for the sake of our student athletes and for staff and coaches as well, too, for their workplace experiences. And so that role came out of, one, I think an interest in the university's part and having somebody who had prior worked in diversity and inclusion. So, prior to my 5 years in athletics, I'd worked for 6 years in the Office of Multicultural Affairs as a director and a leader of our African American Cultural Center at LSU as well. And so I think there was an interest there in having someone who had that experience at the university level. And then on my part, diversity and inclusion just has always been an interest of mine. And so I too was also open to figuring out a way to increase the visibility of diversity and inclusion for our department. And so it was kind of just a mutual decision and discussion of how we could make the experience for our student athletes better, particularly for students of color and our coaches and staff of color too. So that's kind of how we got started. It was pretty organic.
Right, especially with you having the experience already. I wonder about the conversation in terms of expectations and outcomes when you had the conversation with the athletics director there at LSU, knowing sometimes this position comes on with a lot of influence, but ends up not necessarily having a lot of outcomes because people don't necessarily agree on things over the long term. Talk to me a little bit about that initial conversation, and since being named, what have you put in place, or have you had a chance to accomplish anything yet in the role?
Yeah, definitely was something upon being asked to do the role that I definitely wanted to make sure was authentic and not being used in a way as a puppet or a face, because I am a woman of color. And you want to make sure that if you sign on to do something like that, that you give it your all on my end, but also that the department was really willing to go the distance with this, because it's not a short-term battle, particularly when, like many predominantly white institutions, many public institutions, many large institutions don't have these types of things in place. And so it was a pretty intentional conversation of what it would look like for me to give honest feedback and transparent feedback, and a willingness I felt like I needed to hear on the AD side and the administrative side, that they would really take those things into consideration, not because of my identity as a woman or a person of color, but because it's for the good of our department and for the good of the university. And so I will say, thus far, I think that has happened. We formed a number of support councils and initiatives. We put on a number of events that have been able to spark, I think, leadership and probably even to some extent a level of pride among our student athletes and even staff. I hope. I know that's like a second layer, but over these last few months, or almost a year now, I guess at this point, but being able to really think about what does it look like for permanent change around diversity and inclusion to happen in the department. And that was really critical for that conversation of whether or not we were going to move forward in that way. And ultimately, the hope is that there will be, this will be a permanent seat at the table at the administrative level for someone. I don't know that that's my calling long term to go back into diversity and inclusion full time in this way. But for now, being the person holding this role until we figure out how to make sure that this is a permanent seat at the table so that all of our decisions from now on as a university are also considering diversity and inclusion as an essential makeup, whether that's hiring practices, what does it look like, to have diverse coaching staff, to what does it look like to, even thinking about some of the name, image, likeness stuff that's coming down the pipeline, and what does that look like as far as diversity and inclusion entailed. So it's been pretty interesting to be able to like have a voice around that. And I do feel like leadership has listened thus far. And so my hope is we'll continue in that way until we get to a more permanent decision of how to make sure we get somebody in this role long term.
Right. Interesting. You mentioned staff. Staff probably is one of the most important parts of it, right? So that the student athletes see and feel like, as mentioned when I talked to you and Dr. Marshbell from Baylor, they feel like there's somebody in the department that looks like them, that understands or potentially understands what they're going through. Congratulations on that position. Hopefully it comes out well to where you expect it to come out. I can't imagine where you have the time to do student athlete mental health and to be the senior advisor to the AD for equity, diversity, and inclusion. But I imagine that you're doing it the best you can, and the AD is probably happy with what you're doing. Thinking about your other role, the director of student athlete mental health, you're a licensed professional counselor. And looking back, obviously over quarantine, pandemic, but the 2020 football season across the country, you saw teams and student athletes in and out of quarantine, games postponed, games canceled. Some people's whole seasons were canceled. But thinking about the people who did play a 2020 football season, for a player, for a coach and staff, of stopping and starting as you're trying to play the season, tell me about the impact of that on the players or the team overall, and really the athletics department too, there at LSU.
Yeah, I think it was a lot for everyone. Super sort of emotional experience, I think, in a lot of ways for student athletes, which for me is more of my day to day and talking with them. It's the sort of constant feeling of whether or not, that next game will get played just because of the way things got shut down so abruptly in the spring of 2020. And so I think it was always sort of just in the back of every student athlete's mind of, will we actually finish the season? And if we do, what does that look like? And if we don't, what does that look like? Because a lot of things were happening moment by moment as far as like giving eligibility back from the NCAA and all those things. And so you have, I always think of, in particular, my senior student athletes for any sport, they're always wondering if that's my last moment. And like you and I've talked about in past conversations of the identity of a student athlete, is so closely tied to who they are, especially while they're still actively playing, that it's difficult to be able to imagine that being sort of like taken away from you by something you can't see, like a pandemic, or just feeling like you're not going to get to finish something you started, knowing the mindset of athletes is always centered around perseverance and goal setting. And so I think it was a lot. I think it was pretty overwhelming. But I also feel like a sense of resilience for a lot of our student athletes just kicked in. Being flexible with the rescheduling and still trying to keep up with schoolwork so that they could stay eligible, knowing that school now had changed too, and that most of them were doing classes online. And a lot of my student athletes hated that just because they rather engage in person because that's just the way they function. And so it was interesting just to like kind of ride the wave with them of some weeks feeling really great, like, okay, we've gone a whole stretch with no new cases or no games canceled. And then you hit a weekend where it's closer to some of your bigger games. And, as LSU, we know those are always like Bama, Florida. And I think those were two of our two that got rescheduled this season. And so
Right.
they ultimately got to play them, but it pushed back when games were and that sort of thing. So it was definitely an up and down, like a roller coaster ride for sure of just figuring that out. And I think staff and coaches, it was the same thing, just trying to figure out how to be supportive of our student athletes feeling all those things while also managing our own emotions about, what does it look like to go to work day to day, still knowing there's so much that was unknown still. So it was a wild ride, I feel like.
Well, looking at it, I guess from a national scale, when you talk to some of your colleagues around the country, was there an uptick, I guess, in people who come to visit you and your staff? I mean, or even around the country, did you hear colleagues talking about, yeah, so this is what I'm seeing now? Like, did any of that happen in terms of what you guys do in the role you're in around the country in terms of college athletics with the starts and stops in the pandemic during the season?
Yeah, absolutely. I think knowing that, just like kind of we were talking about before, just the fact that, they're student athletes and they're here to, get an education and to play, but they're people. So we saw, I think, more increases of folks coming in really to talk about life outside of sport, like what was going on at home. A lot of them, their parents had lost jobs and, folks they had to move, or people were isolated or quarantined from other family members, homes were split up. So I definitely feel like we saw an increase across the board in that, and talking with some of my colleagues, which I think in some ways was a lifesaver during this time as well, because you just had people to check in and say, like, what are y'all doing? What's the key here to figuring this out? And I don't think anybody had one answer, but it was clear that for all of us as mental health professionals, we definitely needed to both up our energy and our game around, being able to solve some of the issues that we saw coming in, or at least provide support for them, and then figuring out, okay, well, how do we create something for the long haul of what this is going to look like? So, we're in a stage now where we have vaccines and all those things happening, but I mean, it's still taking a toll on a lot of athletes and their families long term. And so, how do we offer that type of support again for the player that won't get a chance to play now that football is over? They're either trying to figure out, can they train somewhere for the draft, and how do you do that when COVID is still running rampant? Like, it's just sort of interesting to see how far extending this has been. Besides just, I think, the few months that we thought all of us thought this would be when everything first kicked off with COVID. So yeah, it's been pretty widespread, and I feel like my colleagues and myself have tried to put our heads together over a lot of different things to figure out the best way to offer support.
I imagine there's probably some semblance of solace to have other colleagues who go through the same things you go through that you can lean on for advice in terms of the student athlete and mental health environment in college athletics.
Oh my goodness. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I wouldn't make it
Right,
without
right.
them.
I wonder, was there, is there something that was learned during the football season that could possibly be applied or implemented to other sports seasons that are maybe taking place now or in the near future in terms of mental wellness and mental health for student athletes? I mean, was there anything that you can take from that first season during the pandemic to apply now, maybe the basketball season or other seasons that may come up in the spring and winter season?
Yeah, I think definitely just the flexibility piece for sure. Just knowing that this is such a new thing still, even though it's been like a year. I feel like that we've been thinking or talking about COVID, but there's no way that any of us in this lifetime thought we'd be living through a pandemic. And so there's so much that we just don't know. And so the flexibility, I think, is key for sure. And then I think the acceptance part, or the validating part of letting, like, your student athletes know, or your staff know, whether that's coaches or otherwise, that it's okay that you don't feel normal or good about this time. I think, with sport, people always see it as this like great unifier and this thing that brings a lot of happiness, which, it can be, but um, nothing about this time feels normal. And so I think all of us have tried to find ways to find whatever our new normal is personally. And so for sport, I think it's being able to recognize that's going to happen in this way too, and that there's going to be just a huge, I think, learning curve still with what it looks like for our spring sports now, like you mentioned, like basketball, baseball, softball, and those teams trying to figure out, will they make it through a season too, because some of those same protocols still have to happen. Like, as a staff person who works closely with women's basketball right now, I get tested 3 times a week just to make sure that both I'm keeping them safe, they're keeping me safe, and so I can still travel and do my job as a mental performance consultant with them. And so those are things that's not normal for my day to be flexed around, getting COVID tested. And so for student athletes, it's the same thing, like having to fit that in while still keeping up with school, still trying to understand if their family back home is okay. And again, with college athletics, you have athletes at one school that are from all over the world. And so just being able to recognize that too is coming in to the court or the gym or wherever you're practicing or playing each day too. So I just hope people will give maybe that same like grace and courtesy to our spring sports because they need it too. And in all honesty, I felt like the trauma of it hit them a little bit more because many of these spring sports, like, basketball, softball, gymnastics, they got cut short. They were right on the brink of their conference championships and national championships. And, our men's basketball team was at the NCAA tournament ready to play their first game and got put back on a plane, and so it's just interesting to know that this group too, they've experienced the trauma in a different way where I think there's a little bit more anxiety of whether or not they'll actually make it through this time. And we're hoping for it, but I could definitely relate to how they're feeling. And I hope that other people will give sort of that same grace and courtesy as they work through it.
All right, which makes a position like yours very important. You mentioned something, a mental performance consultant with the women's basketball team. What exactly is that?
So it's kind of a combined role. So obviously serving as, director of student athlete mental health, I'm always focused on that. But in particular, Coach Nikki, who's wonderful, has utilized my other skill set in being able to provide mental wellness, mental skills training to help our athletes in general focus on, increasing their abilities or maybe even just focusing those abilities to the best that they can be. And so in the past, and I'm using her as an example just because I've worked with women's basketball the most during my time in athletics. I would spend our summer, when they're in summer training, I also get an hour with them once a week to do mental skills training and offer them tools and support on being better teammates, better players, understanding how to, find their zone when they're maybe in the middle of a stressful game. And so it's similar to, the mental health work that we do, but the focus is solely on their athletic performance. And so that's been pretty cool to also see how many of our student athletes have stayed so focused. And part of that's because most of them have been playing their sports since they were 5, on club leagues and park leagues. But it's interesting to see how that kind of kicks in naturally for them as far as their sport performance. And so sometimes I feel like I'm just there. I don't know if I'm actually helping, but I think it's being able to have that person that is, separate and unbiased still, but can help them really talk through and think through some of the challenges that they may be facing as an athlete solely, not just, the personal stuff too. So it's a cool job. That's why I love my job so much. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, I'm sure the basketball coach actually appreciates what you do and feels like you are doing something. So where we have the mental health and wellness counseling, we have the mental and athletic performance counseling, we have equity, diversity, and inclusion advising the athletics director. We are doing a whole lot at LSU right now. I don't even know how you have the time to do all that. I'm not even sure you know how you had the time to do it, but you do it right at a high level. When you think about all those things we just talked about, all the various roles you play in athletics, and you think about the talking points when you sit down with the AD there in terms of diversity, equity, inclusion, in terms of mental health and wellness, in terms of mental focus and athletic performance, what are some of the conversations you have with the AD, one, and then two, when you talk to your colleagues about the industry in general of college athletics and mental health and wellness, what are some of the conversations and talking points, A, from the local level when you're talking to your athletics director, and then B, when you talk to other people in the industry?
I think the first thing is that all of those things are innately connected, right? So like the mental health piece, the diversity and inclusion and social justice piece, as well as athletic performance, and like having those sometimes tough conversations about how they sort of have to remain connected in order for things to function as planned. I'm not an AD, but I do understand that from an AD's perspective, there is a goal there of having your team be the best to win and also bring in money and funding, and understanding that that doesn't happen if your teams don't play well or if your coaches are unhappy or any of those things. And so I think for me the conversation is always how can we make sure that we are hitting all of the areas or the needs of an individual, so that they produce in the way that they want to, but also in the way that those letters across their uniform maybe need them to. And so it's a mutual relationship a lot of times to be able to be a college student athlete, knowing that there's a prize there in getting an education, and also if you're interested in taking your sport to the next level professionally, if that's an option for you, this school allows you maybe to do that and have a platform to do that. But at the same time, that university is also very much interested in, or should be interested in, your personal growth and that sort of thing. And so that's always my mantra or soapbox is, are we doing everything we really can to meet all those needs so that the university itself or the athletics department itself is seeing what it would like to see happen as far as its needs as a department. And so I just always hope that that is coming across in my conversations. That's always critical. I think in thinking about that across the industry, I think it's kind of the same. For the first time in a very long time, or maybe ever, our athletics departments even thinking about sort of the other layers of identity related to being a college student athlete. And so myself and other colleagues, I think it's refreshing, probably to an extent for me more so as a person of color, but also as a mental health practitioner, to see heads of leadership and coaches and administration saying the words mental health and talking about social justice and having even the conversations of decision making around what does it look like if somebody kneels during the national anthem, and what type of support is needed on both sides of that, and education on both sides of that for fans, for players. It's been a whirlwind, but it's also been pretty cool to see all of that play out. And I think those conversations are not going anywhere anytime soon, or at least I hope they're not, because we're not done yet. I mean, there's just so much left to think about, because had we not all been stuck inside at home back in May, when the George Floyd murder happened, I don't know that many athletic departments or universities as a whole would be thinking this intently about what does it mean to really serve their students, and serve their student athletes. And so it's been refreshing to an extent, but also, it's exhausting. And I can totally see how we're going to need to continue to be there for our student athletes as they try to navigate too, where they feel like they fit in finding their voice, using their voice, being advocates for what causes they believe in. So all that stuff now has to get worked in to athletics departments where they didn't have it before. Like, I feel like people's life skills programs should be evolving right now. Their mental health departments should be evolving right now, just so that we're doing our part when we bring these students here, when we recruit them, we go in their homes, we tell their parents we're going to take care of them. Are we really sending them out afterwards with everything that they need, to be able to be productive in whatever way that is, in a professional career in sport or in something else? And so those are the types of things that I think now are kind of at the forefront of broader conversations, and practitioners in my field, I think, are thinking of even how we broaden the scope of, like, what does mental health even mean for an athletics department? So we are talking about more of, clinical mental health, but also mental performance training, but also social justice, and also life skills and all those things. So it's ever evolving, but I feel hopeful that we'll get it right, and that the areas where we don't, we'll keep trying, and we'll get input from student athletes on how to make it right, because I mean, we do this for them. So that has been the goal, and what I'm hoping is the direction we'll continue to be headed in.
And LSU, with you as part of the staff, essentially filling 3 potential full-time roles, is all for the better to keep moving forward and keep progressing, with you advising them on the number of things that you do and will continue to advise them on. And hopefully they continue to grow the staff so that it expands onto the university and the whole Southeastern Conference and college athletics as well. Dr. Poole, this has been an excellent conversation. I really appreciate you joining us here on One Question.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
That was Dr. LaKeitha Poole. She's a director of student athlete mental health and currently the interim senior advisor to the athletics director for equity, diversity, and inclusion at LSU. And of course, this is Ty Brown with One Question. And keep in mind, the role of a leader is to create and maintain an environment that people want to be a part of. And as always, be better tomorrow than you are today. This episode of the One Question Leadership Podcast is produced by Spades Media Group, solving problems using creative leadership.